The bullet missed Beatrice Olsen's head by less than 3 inches, and she didn't even know it until the cowboy tackled her to the dusty Nevada ground. "Stay down," he commanded, his body shielding hers as another shot rang out across the desert landscape. The surveying equipment her father had been using crashed to the ground, the theodolite's brass glinting in the harsh afternoon sun of August 1882. Beatrice's breath came in sharp gasps, her cheek pressed against the hot earth, the weight of the stranger both terrifying and oddly reassuring. She could feel his heart hammering against her back, smell the leather and sage that clung to his clothes. Above them, her father Charles Olsen shouted something she couldn't make out over the ringing in her ears. "Railroad men," the cowboy muttered, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "They don't want this land surveyed proper. Stay still." The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. The cowboy remained motionless for several long moments before slowly lifting himself off her. Beatrice rolled over, blinking up at him. He was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his worn hat and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dust covered his denim shirt and leather vest, and a revolver hung at his hip. "You hurt, miss?" he asked, extending a calloused hand to help her up. "No, I." Beatrice took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip as he pulled her to her feet. Her legs trembled and she had to steady herself against him for a moment. "Thank you. You saved my life." "Matthew Walsh, madam." He touched the brim of his hat. "Your father hired me in Silver Peak 3 days ago to guide and protect this expedition. Wish I'd been faster on the draw." "Beatrice," her father called, hurrying over. At 53, Charles Olsen still moved with surprising agility, though his beard had gone mostly gray. "Are you unharmed?" "Thanks to Mr. Walsh," she said, brushing dust from her split riding skirt. The practical garment had scandalized some of the ladies back east, but out here in the Nevada desert, it was essential. Her white blouse was now thoroughly brown with dirt. Charles nodded grimly at Matthew. "Second attack this week. The railroad companies know if I complete this survey, it'll prove the original land grants were fraudulent. They've built 3 miles of track on land that rightfully belongs to the ranchers and the Paiute tribes." "We should make camp early," Matthew suggested, scanning the rocky outcroppings where the shots had come from. "Find somewhere defensible. This open ground makes us easy targets." Beatrice retrieved her father's equipment, checking it carefully for damage. She'd been assisting him with surveys since she was 14, learning to read maps and calculate elevations with the same precision her father demanded. At 22, she could operate every piece of equipment they carried and had drafted dozens of property maps herself. It was unconventional work for a woman, but Charles had no sons, and Beatrice had inherited his passion for turning the chaos of wilderness into ordered, measured certainty. "The theodolite's lens is cracked," she announced, disappointment heavy in her voice. "We'll need to rely on the compass and chain measurements until we can get it repaired." Matthew was already gathering their horses, 3 sturdy animals that had been grazing nearby. "There's a canyon about 2 miles northeast. High walls, only one way in. We can defend it if need be." They rode in silence, Matthew in the lead on his gray gelding, followed by Beatrice and her chestnut mare, with Charles bringing up the rear on his bay. The Nevada landscape stretched endlessly around them, all sage and scrub and distant mountains painted purple by the afternoon light. Heat shimmered off the ground in waves, making the horizon seem to dance. Beatrice found herself watching Matthew's back as they rode, the easy way he sat his horse, how his head kept moving, constantly alert for danger. She knew nothing about him except that he'd appeared in Silver Peak the day before they were scheduled to depart, asking if they needed a guide. Her father, already nervous about the threats they'd received, had hired him on the spot. The canyon Matthew led them to was everything he'd promised. Red sandstone walls rose 100 feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that opened into a sheltered bowl perhaps 50 yards across. A thin stream trickled along one edge, and there were even a few scraggly cottonwood trees providing shade. "This is perfect," Charles said approvingly. "We can work from here, make day trips to complete the survey sections." While her father unpacked his remaining equipment, Beatrice helped Matthew tend to the horses. He worked efficiently, unsaddling each animal and checking their hooves with practiced motions. "How long have you been a guide?" she asked, carrying saddles to a flat rock. "I'm not," Matthew replied, surprising her with his honesty. "I'm a ranch hand, was anyway. Worked the double bar spread near Carson City until it got bought out by Eastern investors last spring." "Then why did you claim to be a guide?" He met her eyes directly. "Because I heard your father asking around town about the survey, and I heard the railroad men talking about stopping him. Seemed like somebody needed to help. You took this job knowing people would try to kill us." Beatrice wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned. "I took this job because what's happening isn't right." Matthew's jaw tightened. "The railroad companies have been stealing land from small ranchers for years. My boss at the double bar, he fought them in court for 18 months before they wore him down. Lost everything. If your father's survey can prove their claims are fraudulent, maybe it'll help folks get justice." There was something in his voice when he spoke about justice, a deep conviction that reminded Beatrice of her father. She found herself wanting to know more about this cowboy who'd thrown himself between her and bullets for a cause he believed in. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "I could make coffee at least." "Coffee sounds mighty fine, Miss Olsen." "Beatrice," she corrected. "If you're going to be protecting my life, we can dispense with formalities." The corner of his mouth quirked up. "Beatrice, then, and I'm Matthew." She built a small fire using dried sage branches while Matthew scouted the canyon entrance. Charles was already absorbed in his notes, plotting out the next day's work by the fading light. Beatrice had brought coffee beans from Silver Peak, and she ground them between 2 stones, enjoying the rich aroma. It was a simple pleasure, but one she'd learned to savor on expeditions like this. When the coffee was ready, she poured 3 tin cups and brought one to her father, who accepted it absently, still muttering calculations. Matthew had returned and was checking his rifle, a Winchester that looked well maintained. "You think they'll try again tonight?" Beatrice asked, handing him a cup. "Maybe. Probably not, though. That canyon entrance is too narrow. They'd be fools to try it in the dark." He sipped the coffee and nodded appreciatively. "This is good. Better than the campfire swill I'm used to." "Secret's in not boiling it too hard," Beatrice said, settling onto a rock near the fire. The temperature was already dropping with the sun, the desert's heat fleeing into the clear sky. "You let the ground steep gentle like tea. You've done a lot of camping." "I've been helping my father with surveys since I was a girl. We've mapped property lines all over Nevada and California." She smiled at the memories. "My mother thought it was completely inappropriate. She wanted me learning embroidery and piano, preparing for a proper marriage. What happened to change her mind? She died when I was 15, pneumonia." Beatrice's smile faded. "After that, it was just Papa and me. He needed an assistant and I needed purpose, I suppose. Something beyond waiting for some gentleman to come court me." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "My mother wanted me to be a lawyer. She'd saved money for years to send me to school back east, thought I'd bring honor to the family name. Why didn't you go? She died before I turned 18. Influenza took half our town that winter." He stared into his coffee cup. The money went to burying her and keeping my sister fed until she was old enough to work. By then, I was better with horses than books anyway. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled over the canyon. Stars began to appear overhead, so many and so bright that the sky seemed crowded with them. Beatrice had never gotten used to that sight, no matter how many nights she'd spent under western skies. "You think we can finish the survey?" she asked quietly. "If they keep attacking us?" Matthew looked at her, his face serious in the firelight. "I think if your father's work is as important as it seems, we don't have much choice but to try. But I won't lie to you, Beatrice. It's going to be dangerous. I'm not afraid of danger." She said it firmly, but even as the words left her mouth, she remembered the terror of those bullets, the way her hands had shaken when she'd stood up. "Being afraid isn't weakness," Matthew said softly. "Fear keeps you alert, keeps you alive. It's what you do despite the fear that matters." Before Beatrice could respond, Charles called out that he had the next day's route planned. They spent an hour going over maps by lantern light, Charles explaining what measurements they needed and why. The railroad company had claimed their land grants extended to a creek bed that local ranchers insisted was several hundred yards north of where the company said it was. Charles's survey would establish the truth definitively. "If I'm right," Charles said, tapping the map, "the railroad built 3 miles of track and 2 water stations on land they never legally owned. That's grand theft, plain and simple. And if they can steal from ranchers, they can steal from anyone," Matthew added, "including the Paiute people whose territories they've been encroaching on." Charles nodded approvingly. "You understand the stakes, Mr. Walsh. Good. We'll need clear heads and steady hands to see this through." They divided the watch into 3 shifts. Matthew insisted on taking both the first and last, saying he was used to broken sleep from ranch work. Beatrice took the middle shift, from midnight to 3 in the morning. She tried to sleep as Matthew settled near the canyon entrance, rifle across his knees, but her mind kept returning to those moments on the ground, his body protecting hers. She'd known many men in her 22 years: surveyors, engineers, ranch owners, businessmen who'd hired her father. But there was something different about Matthew Walsh, something in the way he spoke about right and wrong with such simple conviction, as if the world's complexities could be navigated by an internal compass, always pointing toward justice. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of maps that wouldn't stay still, of lines that kept shifting and changing no matter how carefully she drew them. Matthew woke her gently, his hand on her shoulder. "Your watch," he said quietly. "All's been quiet. I checked the horses an hour ago." Beatrice sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. The fire had burned down to coals, giving off just enough light to see Matthew's face. He showed her where he'd been sitting, the best vantage point to watch the canyon entrance. "If you see or hear anything unusual, wake me immediately," he instructed. "Don't try to investigate on your own." "I'm not foolish," she said, a bit more sharply than she'd intended. Being underestimated because of her gender was a constant irritation. "Didn't say you were." Matthew's tone was mild. "But you're also not armed, and whoever's been shooting at us has already proven they don't care about killing a woman." He had a point. Beatrice settled into the watch position, her father's revolver in her lap. She did know how to shoot, though Matthew hadn't asked. The night was full of small sounds. Wind sighing through the canyon, the horses shifting and breathing, an owl calling somewhere in the distance. She thought about her life before this expedition. They'd been living in Sacramento, where her father had a small office and took on surveying jobs throughout Northern California and Nevada. Beatrice had kept his books, drafted his maps, and occasionally assisted in the field when the client didn't object to a woman's presence. It was a constrained existence in many ways, always having to prove herself, always fighting against expectations of what a young woman should be and do. But out here, with just her father and Matthew, none of that seemed to matter. They needed her skills, her knowledge. The work was what counted, not her gender. The 3 hours passed uneventfully. When it was time to wake Charles for his watch, Beatrice found Matthew had already woken and was boiling water for coffee. He must sleep like a cat, she thought, able to wake at the slightest sound. Anything? He asked. Nothing but peace and quiet. Good. He handed her a cup of coffee as Charles took up the watch position. You should sleep more if you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But Beatrice found she didn't want to sleep. The stars were beginning to fade, the sky lightening to gray in the east. She sat near the fire, watching Matthew's face in the growing dawn. He had a scar along his jawline that she hadn't noticed before, and his hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, were marked with the calluses and small scars of hard work. "Tell me about your sister," she said. "You said you helped raise her, Mary." "She's 19 now, works as a seamstress in Virginia City. Smart as a whip, that one. Taught herself to read and cipher when she was barely old enough to hold a pencil." Pride warmed his voice. "She wanted to be a teacher, but we couldn't afford the normal school. That's a shame. Good teachers are worth their weight in gold. She's happy enough, I think. Got engaged last spring to a telegraph operator. Decent fellow, treats her well." Matthew smiled, but there was something wistful in it. She doesn't need her big brother looking after her anymore. "Is that why you took this job? Because you were at loose ends?" He considered the question. "Partly. But also because I'm tired of seeing powerful men crush everyone in their path. The railroad companies, the mining corporations, the land speculators, they take and take and take, and ordinary folks just have to accept it. Your father's survey, if it proves the fraud, that's a chance to push back. Small chance, maybe, but better than nothing." Beatrice understood that feeling, the frustration of injustice, the desire to make something right even in the face of long odds. It was what drove her father, she knew, and increasingly what drove her own work. "We'll finish the survey," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Matthew met her eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding, a shared commitment. "Yes," he agreed. "We will." The sun rose over the canyon walls, flooding their camp with golden light. Charles joined them for breakfast: salt pork and hardtack, washed down with more coffee, and then they prepared for the day's work. The plan was to establish a series of survey points along the disputed boundary line, using the compass and chain measurements to plot exact positions. "I'd like Beatrice to stay here," Charles said, loading equipment into saddlebags. "No," Beatrice said immediately. "You need me to record the measurements. It's too dangerous. Papa, you hired Matthew to protect us. Let him do his job. You can't manage the surveying chain and take notes simultaneously, and you know it." Charles looked unhappy but couldn't argue with her logic. Matthew spoke up quietly. "I'll keep her safe, sir. You have my word." They rode out an hour after sunrise, following the creek bed north. The morning air was still cool, but Beatrice knew that wouldn't last. By noon, the temperature would be sweltering. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had wrapped a scarf around her neck for extra protection from the sun. Matthew rode point, constantly scanning the terrain. Beatrice noticed he chose their route carefully, avoiding open areas where they might be exposed to ambush, keeping to low ground when possible. He knew what he was doing, despite his claim to be just a ranch hand. "Have you done this before?" she asked during a brief rest. "Protected people, I mean. Ran off some claim jumpers once when I was working a spread near Tonopah," Matthew said. And I rode with a posse tracking horse thieves a few years back. Nothing like this, though. You seem to know what you're doing. Common sense, mostly. Stay alert. Think about where danger might come from. Don't take unnecessary risks." He smiled slightly. "And a bit of luck never hurts." They reached the first survey point by mid-morning. Charles set up his equipment and Beatrice prepared to record measurements. The work was painstaking and precise. Charles would sight along the compass, call out bearings, and Beatrice would note them down. Then they'd use the surveyor's chained 66 feet of metal links to measure distances, moving systematically across the landscape. Matthew kept watch, positioning himself where he could see in all directions. Beatrice found his presence reassuring. There was a quiet competence about him that inspired confidence. They worked through the heat of the day, stopping only briefly to eat and water the horses. By late afternoon, they'd established 6 survey points and covered nearly 2 miles of terrain. Charles was pleased with their progress. "If we can maintain this pace, we'll complete the survey in 2 weeks, he said, carefully packing away his instruments. "Assuming no more interruptions," Matthew added, his eyes on the horizon. They were packing up the last of the equipment when Matthew suddenly stiffened. "Riders," he said quietly, "coming from the east, 4 of them." Beatrice's heart jumped. She followed his gaze and saw the dust cloud. "What do we do?" "Mount up, slow and easy. We'll head back toward the canyon, but we don't run unless they come at us hostile." Matthew's voice was calm, but his hand rested on his revolver. Could be they're just passing through. But as the riders drew closer, it became clear they weren't passing through. They adjusted their course to intercept, pushing their horses to a canter. Matthew positioned himself between them and Beatrice and Charles. The 4 men pulled up in a cloud of dust. They were rough-looking characters, all armed, wearing the dusty clothes of men who spent their days in the saddle. The one in front, a heavy-set man with a beard stained yellow by tobacco, spat on the ground. "This here's private land," he announced. "You're trespassing." "This is public land according to the Territorial Survey of 1874, Charles replied evenly. "We have every right to be here. Don't matter what some old map says. The railroad owns everything from the creek bed south. That includes where you're standing." Matthew spoke for the first time. "The gentleman is a surveyor, conducting an official survey to establish property boundaries. We're not looking for trouble. Should have thought of that before you started poking around where you don't belong." The bearded man's hand moved toward his gun. Matthew's revolver was out and cocked before the man's hand reached his holster. The speed of it shocked Beatrice. One moment Matthew's hand was resting casually on his saddle horn. The next, he was holding a gun aimed directly at the bearded man's chest. "Let's all stay calm," Matthew said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "We're leaving now. No need for anyone to get hurt." For a long moment, nobody moved. The bearded man's companions had their hands on their weapons but hadn't drawn. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Then one of the other men, younger and with a nervous look, said, "We was just supposed to warn them, Caleb." Nobody said nothing about shooting. Caleb's face darkened, but after another moment he relaxed slightly. "Fine. But you hear this any more surveying and there will be shooting. The railroads paid good money for this land and they don't take kindly to troublemakers." "Duly noted," Charles said stiffly. Matthew gestured with his revolver. "Back up your horses, nice and slow, then you can be on your way." The 4 men complied, wheeling their horses around once they put some distance between them. As they rode off, Caleb called back, "This is your only warning." Matthew didn't holster his gun until they were well out of sight. Even then, he kept it in his hand as they rode back toward the canyon. "That was well handled," Charles said once they were moving. "For now," Matthew replied grimly. But they'll be back, and next time they won't just talk. Back at camp, they discussed their options over dinner. Charles was determined to continue the survey despite the threats. If we stop now, the railroad wins. All those ranchers lose their land and there's no recourse. I agree we should continue, Matthew said, but we need to be smarter about it. They know where we're camping now. We should find a new base. There's an old mining camp about 5 miles west of here, Beatrice offered. We passed near it 2 summers ago when Papa was surveying a ranch property. It's abandoned, but the buildings were still standing. That would give us better shelter than open camping. Good thinking. Matthew looked at her with approval that made something warm bloom in her chest. We'll move at first light. That night, Beatrice took her watch shift with heightened awareness. Every sound made her tense, her hand gripping her father's revolver. She kept thinking about how fast Matthew had drawn his gun, the absolute surety in his movements. He was more than just a ranch hand. She was certain of that now. When he came to relieve her, she asked, "Where did you learn to handle a gun like that?" Matthew was silent for a moment. "My father was a lawman, sheriff of a little town in California called Pine Flat. He taught me to shoot from the time I was old enough to hold a pistol. He was killed in a bank robbery when I was 17, shot down in the street." Matthew's voice was flat, emotionless, but Beatrice could hear the old pain underneath. "The robbers got away. They never were caught. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." But the way he said it suggested the wound was still fresh. "I thought about following in his footsteps, becoming a lawman myself. But after my mother died and I had Mary to look after, I needed steady work. Ranching paid better than sheriffing. Do you regret it, not becoming a sheriff, sometimes?" Matthew looked up at the stars. "I like to think I would have been good at it, that I would have helped people the way my father did. But life doesn't always go the way you plan." "No," Beatrice agreed softly. "It certainly doesn't." She went to her bedroll but found sleep elusive. The stars were still bright overhead, and she lay looking up at them, thinking about Matthew's father, about justice and vengeance and the thin line between them. She thought about her own mother, how illness had stolen her before Beatrice was truly ready to face the world without her. Everyone carried losses, she supposed. It was what you built from the ruins that mattered. They broke camp at dawn and made their way to the abandoned mining camp. It was exactly as Beatrice remembered, a collection of weathered wooden buildings clustered around what had once been a silver mine. The mine itself was boarded up, but several of the structures were still sound, including a bunkhouse and what might have been an office. "This will do nicely," Charles said, inspecting the bunkhouse. "Solid walls, good sight lines. Much more defensible than that canyon." They spent the morning making the place habitable, sweeping out years of accumulated dust and debris, checking for scorpions and snakes, and establishing a small corral for the horses. By afternoon, they had something approaching a comfortable camp. Over the next several days, they fell into a routine. Each morning they'd ride out to continue the survey work, with Matthew always alert for danger. Each evening they'd return to the mining camp, where Beatrice would help her father plot the day's measurements on his maps while Matthew prepared dinner. They saw no more railroad men, but the threat hung over them like a storm cloud. During the long hours of survey work, Beatrice found herself talking with Matthew more and more. He had an easy way of conversing, asking questions that showed genuine interest in her life and experiences. She learned that he loved horses, that he'd once considered moving to Oregon to start his own ranch, that he played the harmonica but was too embarrassed to do so in front of people. In turn, she told him about her education, her mother's disapproval of her unladylike interests, her dream of one day opening her own surveying business. "People don't take women seriously in this field," she said, as they waited for her father to complete a measurement. "Even when they know I'm as good as any man with the instruments." "Their loss," Matthew said simply. "You're the best assistant surveyor I've ever seen." "I'm the only assistant surveyor you've ever seen. Still counts." He smiled at her, and Beatrice felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. She was falling for him. The realization came to her one evening as she watched him care for the horses, his movements gentle despite his rough, calloused hands. She was falling for this cowboy with his quiet strength and his strong moral compass and his sad gray eyes. It was foolish, she told herself. They came from different worlds. Once this survey was complete, he'd return to ranch work and she'd go back to Sacramento with her father. There was no future in these feelings. But knowing that didn't stop her heart from beating faster when he was near, didn't stop her from finding excuses to work beside him, didn't stop her from lying awake during her watch shift, thinking about the way he said her name. 10 days into the survey, they had a breakthrough. Charles completed a series of measurements that definitively proved the railroad's claims were fraudulent. The actual boundary line was nearly a quarter-mile north of where the company said it was. "This is it," Charles said, his voice shaking with excitement as he plotted the final points on his map. "This proves they've been lying. With this documentation, the ranchers can take the railroad to court and win." "How much longer until the survey's complete?" Matthew asked. 3 more days. 4 at most. Charles looked up from his map. "We're almost there." That night, they celebrated with the last of their coffee beans and a tin of peaches Charles had been saving. As darkness fell and they sat around the fire, Beatrice felt a curious mixture of triumph and melancholy. They'd succeeded in their task, or nearly so. But success meant the expedition would end, and ending the expedition meant saying goodbye to Matthew. "What will you do after this?" she asked him as they sat together, slightly apart from where her father was absorbed in his maps. "Find work, I suppose. There's always ranches hiring." Matthew poked at the fire with a stick. "Thought I might head up toward Oregon like I always planned. Land's cheaper there. To start your own ranch, maybe. Or maybe just to see something new." He glanced at her. "What about you?" "Back to Sacramento. Back to the office and the account books and clients who'd prefer not to deal with a woman." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "You could start your own business. You've got the skills. Women can't get surveying licenses in California." "I can assist, but I can't work independently." It was a source of constant frustration. "Maybe someday that will change, but not soon enough for me." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames. Then Matthew said quietly, "I'm going to miss this, working with you and your father. Feeling like the work matters. I'll miss it too." She looked at him, wanting to say more, wanting to tell him that it wasn't just the work she'd miss but him, his presence, his steady strength. But the words stuck in her throat. Matthew met her eyes, and for a moment she thought he might say something. But then Charles called out a question about one of the measurements, and the moment passed. They finished the survey 3 days later. Charles was elated, his final maps showing conclusively that the railroad had built on land they didn't own. As they packed up the equipment for the last time, Beatrice felt tears threatening. This was ending, all of it, and she wasn't ready. Matthew had been quiet all morning, his face unreadable. As they loaded the horses, he finally spoke to Charles. "We should push through and make Silver Peak by tonight. Get those maps somewhere safe as soon as possible." "Agreed," Charles said. "The sooner these are filed with the territorial office, the better." The ride back to Silver Peak took most of the day. Beatrice barely noticed the landscape passing by, too caught up in her own thoughts. What would she say to Matthew when they arrived? How did you thank someone for saving your life? For making you feel seen and valued? For making you fall in love with them even though it was hopeless? They reached Silver Peak as the sun was setting, the town's scattered buildings painted gold and orange by the dying light. Silver Peak wasn't much a main street with a few businesses, some scattered houses, and the territorial office where Charles would file his survey results. "There's a boarding house where Beatrice and I are staying," Charles told Matthew as they dismounted in front of the territorial office. "Mrs. Henderson keeps a clean establishment. You're welcome to take a room there tonight before you head on. Appreciate it, but I should be moving along." Matthew started unpacking the surveying equipment from the horses, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Nonsense," Charles said firmly. "I haven't paid you yet. The least I can do is buy you dinner and see you have a decent bed for the night." Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "One night, then. Thank you." Charles took his maps into the territorial office while Beatrice and Matthew walked the horses to the livery stable. They worked in awkward silence, and Beatrice felt the weight of all her unspoken words pressing down on her. "Matthew," she finally began, but he interrupted her. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing the job." "It was more than just a job." She touched his arm, making him turn to face her. "You know it was." His jaw tightened. "Beatrice, don't. You're going back to Sacramento. I'm heading to Oregon. We both knew this was temporary." "Did we?" She searched his face. "Because I don't remember agreeing to that." "You deserve better than a drifting cowboy with no prospects." "Don't you dare tell me what I deserve." Anger flared in her chest. "I'm not some delicate flower who needs protection from her own feelings. I know what I want." "And what's that?" There was something raw in his voice now, the careful control slipping. "You," she said simply. "I want you, Matthew Walsh. I don't care if it's complicated or impractical or makes no sense. I want you." He stared at her, and she saw the battle playing out behind his eyes. Then he closed the distance between them in 2 strides and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Beatrice had received from the few suitors her mother had approved back east. This was fire and need and desperation, his hands in her hair, her fingers clutching his shirt. This was every unspoken word from the past 2 weeks pouring out in a single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I can't give you the life you deserve," he whispered. "Stop deciding what I deserve. Let me choose." She pulled back to look at him. "I choose you if you'll have me." "If I'll," he laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "Beatrice, I've been half in love with you since the day I tackled you to keep you from getting shot. If you'll have me is not the question. The question is whether your father will let me court you properly, and whether we can figure out a life that works for both of us." "We'll make it work," Beatrice said firmly. "Together." They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, both aware they had complicated conversations ahead but unwilling to let go of each other just yet. Charles was waiting on the porch, and his eyebrows rose when he saw them. "I see," he said neutrally. "Papa, Beatrice began, but Charles held up a hand. "Let's have dinner first. Then we'll talk." Mrs. Henderson's dining room was full of the boarding house's other guests, but they found a table in the corner. Over plates of roast chicken and potatoes, Charles studied Matthew with the same intensity he brought to his surveying work. "What are your intentions toward my daughter, Mr. Walsh?" "To court her properly, sir, if you'll permit it. And if things go as I hope, to marry her." Matthew met Charles's gaze steadily. "I don't have much. I've got about $100 saved, a good horse, and a strong back. But I love your daughter, and I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of her. Beatrice is not just my daughter, she's my business partner. One of the best surveyors I've ever worked with, and I've worked with dozens over the years." Charles leaned back in his chair. "If she marries, I lose her assistance." "No, you don't," Beatrice interjected. "Papa, I can be married and still work. There's no law against it." Your husband might object. Then I wouldn't marry him. She looked at Matthew. Would you object to you doing work you love and are brilliant at? Not a chance. Matthew shook his head, though I'll admit I'm not sure how we'd make it work practically. I need to work to support us, which means ranching or something similar. But if you're working with your father, that means traveling for surveys. What if, Charles said slowly, you both worked with me? A surveying team needs security, as we've proven. And Beatrice needs a partner who understands the work. You're offering me a job. Matthew looked stunned. I'm offering you a place in our business, yes. The work will be sporadic and the pay uncertain, but you'd be traveling with Beatrice rather than separated from her. Charles smiled slightly. And I'd sleep better at night knowing someone with your skills is looking after both of you. Beatrice felt tears stinging her eyes. Papa, that's perfect. It's practical, Charles corrected. Though I'll admit I've grown fond of you, Matthew. You're a good man and you've kept my daughter safe. That counts for a great deal. I don't know what to say, Matthew admitted. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. See that I don't. Over the next weeks, they established a new rhythm. Matthew officially began courting Beatrice. With all the propriety, Charles insisted upon chaperoned walks, parlor visits, carefully observed boundaries. But their eyes spoke volumes that words couldn't, and Beatrice had never been happier. The ranchers, armed with Charles's survey data, filed suit against the railroad company. The territorial court ordered a halt to all railroad construction in the disputed area, pending resolution of the case. It was a victory, if a temporary one, and it felt good to know their work had made a difference. 3 months after they returned from the survey, Charles received a telegram offering a major surveying contract in Colorado. A mining company needed property boundaries established. The pay was excellent and Charles accepted immediately. This is perfect timing, he told Beatrice and Matthew over dinner. We can establish ourselves as a proper surveying firm, Walsh and Olsen Surveying, or Olsen and Walsh if you prefer. I'm not licensed, Matthew pointed out. No, but you will be. I'll train you properly and you can take the examination. With your intelligence and work ethic, you'll pass easily. It was the beginning of something new. That spring, in a simple ceremony at the church in Sacramento, Beatrice Olsen became Beatrice Walsh. Matthew wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but handsome, and Beatrice wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years. I never imagined this, Matthew whispered as they danced at the small reception. Any of this. A month ago I was just a drifter. Now I have a wife, a profession, a future. You always had those things, Beatrice corrected. You just needed someone to help you see them. You mapped a path to my heart, Matthew said softly, pulling her closer. Beatrice smiled, remembering all those maps she'd drawn during the survey, all those careful measurements and precise lines. But the path to Matthew's heart hadn't required precision. It had required courage, honesty, and faith. And you protected mine, she replied. In every way that matters. They moved to Colorado for the mining survey, which took 6 months to complete. True to his word, Charles trained Matthew in proper surveying techniques, and Matthew proved an apt pupil. When they returned to California, Matthew passed the surveying examination on his first attempt. Walsh and Olsen Surveying became a respected name throughout the West. They traveled extensively, mapping property boundaries from Colorado to Oregon, from Nevada to Arizona. It was hard work, often dangerous, but they faced it together. 2 years after their wedding, in a small house they'd bought in Sacramento, Beatrice gave birth to a son. They named him Charles Matthew Walsh, after both grandfathers. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. He's perfect, Matthew said, holding the tiny bundle with the same careful precision he brought to all things. Just like his mother. He's loud and demanding, Beatrice corrected, exhausted but happy. But yes, he's perfect. 3 years later, a daughter arrived, Mary Elizabeth, named for Matthew's sister and Beatrice's mother. She was quieter than her brother, with dark curls and an early fascination with her grandfather's surveying instruments. Charles Olsen, now in his 60s, had begun to slow down. He still oversaw the business, but more and more he left the fieldwork to Matthew and Beatrice. He delighted in his grandchildren, teaching young Charlie to read maps and letting Mary play with his compass. "You've built something good here," he told Beatrice one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Matthew play with the children in the yard. "I'm proud of you, daughter. Your mother would be too." "Thank you, Papa." Beatrice squeezed his hand. "For everything. For teaching me the work, for accepting Matthew, for trusting me to follow my own path. You never gave me much choice about that last part." Charles smiled. "You were always going to follow your own path, with or without my blessing. I'm just glad I was wise enough to support you." The railroad lawsuit concluded in the rancher's favor. The company was forced to pay substantial damages and dismantle the track built on disputed land. It set a precedent that helped other landowners fight similar encroachments. Charles's survey had made a lasting difference. When Charlie was 6 and Mary 3, the family took a trip back to Silver Peak, Nevada. Beatrice wanted to show Matthew and the children where their story had truly begun. The town had grown some in the intervening years, but it was still a small desert settlement. They rode out to the old mining camp where they'd stayed during the survey. The buildings had deteriorated further, but the place still held memories. Beatrice showed the children where she'd worked on maps, where Matthew had kept watch, where her grandfather had made his careful calculations. "This is where you fell in love?" Charlie asked, looking around at the weathered buildings with the skepticism of a 6-year-old. "This is where we admitted we were in love," Matthew corrected. "The falling happened earlier." "When?" Mary wanted to know. Matthew looked at Beatrice, and she saw in his eyes the memory of that first day when he'd tackled her out of the path of a bullet. "The first time I saw your mother," he said, "though it took me a while to realize it. They camped there that night, the 4 of them under the stars." Matthew taught Charlie some basic tracking skills while Beatrice showed Mary how to use a compass. When the children were asleep, Matthew and Beatrice sat together by the fire, just as they had years before. "You have any regrets?" Beatrice asked. "About how your life turned out?" Matthew considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I regret that my parents and your mother aren't here to see what we've built. I regret the hard times we went through, though I suppose they made us stronger, but regret my life with you? Never. Even though it's not the conventional life either of us might have planned, especially because of that." He kissed her temple. "Conventional would have been boring. You were never meant for boring, Beatrice Walsh. Neither were you, Matthew Walsh." When Charles Olsen passed away peacefully in his sleep at 69, surrounded by family, he left the business entirely to Beatrice and Matthew. By then, Walsh and Olsen Surveying had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable surveying firms in the West. They employed 3 assistant surveyors and had contracts throughout 5 territories. Beatrice grieved for her father but took comfort in knowing he'd seen her happy, had known his grandchildren, had witnessed the success of the work they'd built together. They buried him next to Beatrice's mother, and Matthew stood with his arm around his wife, lending her his strength as he always had. Charlie grew up to be a surveyor like his mother and grandfather. Mary, to everyone's surprise, became a lawyer, determined to use the law to help people just as her parents had used surveying. She was one of the first women admitted to the California bar, and she specialized in land disputes and property rights. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Matthew and Beatrice returned once more to Nevada. This time it was just the two of them, their children grown and pursuing their own paths. They rode out to the canyon where Matthew had first saved Beatrice's life, where they'd made that first camp. The place looked smaller than Beatrice remembered, but the memories were vivid. She could almost see her younger self, frightened and determined, meeting this cowboy who would change her life forever. "You remember what you told me?" Matthew asked as they stood looking at the canyon walls. "When I said you deserved better than a drifting cowboy, I told you not to decide what I deserved, that I knew what I wanted. Best words I ever heard." He pulled her close. "You've given me everything, Beatrice. A purpose, a family, a life I never imagined possible." "We gave each other those things," she corrected. "That's how love works. It's not one person saving another. It's two people choosing to build something together." "You're right, as usual," Matthew smiled. "Though I still maintain I got the better end of the deal. We both got exactly what we needed." Beatrice looked up at him, at the gray eyes she'd loved for 20 years, at the face that was older now but still the one she most wanted to see. "We got each other." They stayed in Nevada for a month, retracing the route of that original survey, remembering the dangers they'd faced and the love that had grown despite them. When they returned to Sacramento, it was with renewed appreciation for the life they'd built and the choices they'd made. Matthew never did start his own ranch, but he claimed not to miss it. The work of surveying took them to new places constantly, and they were never in one location long enough to feel trapped. Beatrice never did get her own surveying license. California stubbornly refused to license women for another 30 years, but she ran the business alongside Matthew as an equal partner in everything but name. They had grandchildren eventually. Charlie married a teacher and had 3 children, while Mary married a fellow lawyer and had 2. The Walsh home in Sacramento was always full of noise and life and love. As they grew older, Matthew and Beatrice gradually reduced their fieldwork, training younger surveyors to take over the difficult expeditions. But they never fully retired. Even in their 60s, they'd occasionally take on a local survey job, working together with the ease of decades of practice. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration. Charlie stood to make a toast, and he told the story of how his parents had met the bullets, the survey, the crooked railroad company, the cowboy who'd protected a surveyor's daughter and won her heart. "To 2 people who proved that love can grow even in the harshest conditions," Charlie said, raising his glass, "and who taught all of us what true partnership looks like." As everyone drank, Mary added, "and who showed us that the best maps aren't the ones that chart the land, but the ones that chart the heart." Beatrice looked at Matthew, tears in her eyes, and thought about all the paths they'd walked together. The dangerous ones through Nevada's deserts, yes, but also the everyday paths of marriage and parenthood, of building a business and a life. Every step had been worth it because they'd taken it together. That night, in the quiet of their bedroom, Matthew held Beatrice close. They'd shared a bed for 40 years, and he still marveled at the gift of her presence, still felt grateful for the day he decided to protect a surveyor and his daughter from railroad thugs. "What are you thinking?" Beatrice asked, sensing his wakefulness. "That I never expected to be this happy. That I never believed I deserved this much." He kissed her forehead. "That I'd do it all again, every moment, just to end up right here with you. Even the parts where people were shooting at us, especially those parts. They make the quiet moments more precious." Beatrice laughed softly. "You're a strange man, Matthew Walsh. And you're an extraordinary woman, Beatrice Walsh. You always have been." They drifted to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over them in that Nevada canyon 40 years before, the same stars that would watch over their children and grandchildren as they forged their own paths. The business continued to prosper. Under the leadership of Charlie and several of the younger surveyors, Matthew and Beatrice had trained. Walsh and Olsen surveying expanded throughout the West and even into the new state of Hawaii. The firm became known not just for precision and accuracy, but for integrity and fair dealing, values Matthew and Beatrice had instilled from the beginning. Matthew lived to see his 75th birthday, still sharp and active, still insisting on checking survey calculations himself, even though his hands shook slightly with age. He died as he'd lived, quietly and without fuss, in his own bed with Beatrice beside him. His last words were, "It was all worth it, every single day." Beatrice lived 5 years longer, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored her. She spent her final years writing a history of surveying in the American West, documenting not just the technical advances but the human stories behind the maps. Her chapter about the railroad survey was particularly detailed, and she didn't shy away from describing the corruption and violence they'd faced. On the last page, she wrote, "A map is more than lines on paper. It represents justice, order, and truth in a chaotic world. But the best maps, the ones that matter most, are the ones we draw in our hearts, showing us the way to love, purpose, and home. My husband Matthew was the finest map I ever followed, and he led me to a life beyond anything I could have imagined." When Beatrice passed peacefully in her sleep at 80 years old, they buried her next to Matthew in the cemetery overlooking Sacramento. Their children placed a joint headstone that reads simply, "Matthew and Beatrice Walsh. Together they mapped the West in each other's hearts." Charlie inherited his mother's manuscript and published it through a university press. It became a standard reference for students of Western history, valued both for its technical accuracy and its human insight. The copy Mary kept on her office shelf was worn from constant reference in her legal work, defending property rights. The old mining camp in Nevada, where Matthew and Beatrice had stayed during that first survey, eventually collapsed entirely, returning to the desert dust. But the maps they'd made were preserved in territorial archives, and the precedent they'd helped set continued to protect landowners from corporate overreach for generations. Silver Peak, Nevada remained a small town, but it had a place in Western history now, thanks to the survey that had exposed railroad corruption and the love story that had grown from it. Occasionally, tourists would ask about the Surveyor and the Cowboy who'd worked there in 1882, and old-timers would tell the story of how justice and love had both been found in the Nevada desert. The grandchildren grew up with stories of their grandparents' adventures, of bullets dodged and maps drawn, and a love that had overcome every obstacle. Some became surveyors and lawyers, carrying on the family traditions. Others pursued different paths, but all carried the lessons Matthew and Beatrice had taught. Stand up for what's right, value competence over convention, and when you find love, hold on to it with everything you have. Years after both were gone, on the anniversary of that first Nevada survey, Charlie and Mary made a pilgrimage to the site. The canyon was still there, unchanged by time, still beautiful in its stark desert way. They sat where their parents must have sat, looking up at the same vast sky, feeling connected across the decades to a love story that had shaped their entire family. "You think they knew?" Mary asked. "That day when they met, when he saved her from the bullet, do you think they knew they'd spend their whole lives together?" Charlie considered his sister's question. I don't think they knew, but I think they hoped, and then they chose to make that hope real every single day. They were brave. They were. But more than that, they were committed, to each other, to justice, to building something that mattered. Charlie smiled. We're lucky to be their children, we are indeed. As they rode away from the canyon, the setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had illuminated Matthew and Beatrice's first evening together. The land was eternal, but the love that had bloomed there was eternal too, living on in children and grandchildren, in stories told and lessons learned, in the way a family understood what partnership and courage really meant. In Sacramento, the firm of Walsh and Olsen Surveying continued its work, the name a lasting tribute to two people who'd proven that love and justice could triumph even in the hardest circumstances. New surveyors learned the craft in the same careful way Matthew had learned it from Charles, and they were taught that their work was about more than measurements. It was about truth, fairness, and standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The old house where Matthew and Beatrice had raised their family remained in the family for 3 more generations. The porch where they'd sat on warm evenings, the bedroom where they'd shared 40 years of marriage, the office where they'd drawn countless maps together, all of it was preserved and cherished. And in that office, framed on the wall, hung the original map from the Nevada Survey of 1882, the map that had exposed corruption and changed lives. Beside it hung a small brass plaque with words Beatrice had written shortly before her death. In 1882, a cowboy protected a surveyor's daughter on an expedition through Nevada. In doing so, he protected her heart as well. And she, in turn, showed him that the path to home was through love, commitment, and shared purpose. This map represents justice served, but more importantly, it represents the beginning of a journey we took together, a journey that led to everything that mattered. You mapped a path to my heart, my dearest Matthew, and I followed it gladly every day of my life. And so the story lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that in the wild and dangerous West, amidst gunfights and corruption and endless desert landscapes, love could still bloom. That a chance meeting could change everything. That protecting someone's life could lead to sharing it. That maps could chart not just territory but the human heart, showing the way from loneliness to love, from uncertainty to home. The West was eventually tamed, the frontier closed, the wild spaces measured and mapped and settled. But some things remained unchanged: the capacity for courage in the face of danger, the power of integrity over expediency, and the enduring truth that love, when it's real and true and fought for, can outlast everything else. It can outlast bullets and threats, can survive separation and difficulty, can grow stronger with time rather than weaker. Matthew Walsh and Beatrice Olsen Walsh proved all of that and more. They started with a bullet dodged and a survey to complete, and they ended with a life fully lived, a love fully realized, and a legacy that would inspire everyone who heard their story. That was the true map. They left behind not the professional surveys that bore their names, important as those were, but the map of how to live with courage, love with commitment, and build something that would last long after you were gone. It was a map anyone could follow if they had the courage to try, and in the end that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.